Welcome today to our lecture by Timothy Garton Ash, Professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford. Today's talk is sponsored by CERES, that's the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and CERES's joint initiative for German and European Studies with generous support from the German DAAD. It is also co-sponsored by the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. We're grateful for this support, for events like this, for the presence of Professor Garton Ash, whom Randall Hansen will introduce in a moment. But we're also grateful to the crack staff here, to Tanya, Larissa, Arba, Stacy, Adam, and the whole team for putting together this event. A lot goes into it, and so we're most grateful. I'm Ed Schatz. I'm the director of CERES, and I'm honored to welcome students, colleagues, and friends, both in person and online, to our discussion today. This year, CERES, born in 1963 as the Center for Russian and East European Studies, celebrates its 60th birthday. From the invasions of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan to the Polish Solidarity Movement and the collapse of the socialist bloc and eventually the Soviet Union itself, to the uneven consolidation of European institutions, the rise of Putinism, and so on, our scholars have borne witness and made scholarly sense of all the momentous changes that befall this vast geographic space. And indeed, the space is vast. It covers everything from Portugal in the west to the Chukchi Peninsula in the east to the town of Serhetabat, I just learned, in Turkmenistan in the south. CERES is indeed a vast and important interdisciplinary enterprise and a thriving place for scholars and students. And one of the reasons that it is so successful is the leadership to date that renders the center in great stead. So we have a couple of directors, former directors in the audience. I see Peter Sollerman, there may be others. I want to introduce Randall Hansen, his most recent, now former director, and himself a world-class scholar of European politics and society, as well as global migration. I'm delighted to invite Professor Hansen to introduce our speaker for today. Randall.
Well, thank you, Ed. And let me actually say right back at you, let me thank you as director for your generous support for this event. As Ed said, we turn 60 this year, and for six decades, the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies has been actuated by a single overriding belief. If you do not understand Europe, Russia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, their institutions, their history, their language, and their culture, you do not understand the world. And there is no better speaker than tonight's to help us support that mission. A graduate of the University of Oxford, where he was a student of the Marxist historian Tim Mason, he went to East Germany in the 1970s to study the German resistance, to try to understand, as he once put it to me, how it was that one German became a Stauffenberg and another a Speer. Following a distinguished career in journalism, where he was invariably in the right place at the right time, be it East Berlin, Warsaw, Prague, or Budapest, he became a professor at St. Antony's College, Oxford, and a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and most recently, distinguished fellow here at the Munk School. He has authored no fewer than 11 books, including the magisterial In Europe's Name, Germany and the Divided Continent, a nuanced exploration of the history of German foreign policy, and a devastating critique of Ostpolitik, and, most recently, Homelands, a personal history of Europe. Written, I think, in the same genre as the distinguished historian Fritz Stann's The Five Germanys I Have Known, the book is a fascinating thematic exploration of post-war Europe from the perspective of one who stood and stands at the center of it. In addition to this prolific scholarly record, he is a regular contributor to The Guardian, the New York Review of Books, The Times, The Spectator, and The Independent. Frankly, when he sleeps is a mystery to me. Now, if there's no better person for tonight's lecture, there is no better time to give it. For Europe, a continent, frankly, of crises, faces arguably its greatest since the war. The illegal and genocidal Russian invasion of Ukraine, the ongoing disaster that is Brexit, and the steady march of neo-fascists in Austria, Italy, France, and, in a development I would have thought inconceivable 2 decades ago, the Federal Republic of Germany. Where Europe goes, so goes the world. We need to understand the continent more than ever. To that end, I give you a brilliant historian, a towering public intellectual, and above all, a great European, Timothy Garton Ash.
Randall, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be back here at the University of Toronto at the Monk School, where I've lectured, I've lost count how many times. I mean, at least once also in this room. In fact, I think I lectured at the Monk School before the Monk School existed. And to talk about this subject at this critical moment. This lecture is going to take off from and come back occasionally to the book that you can see outside, but it's not just a book talk. I'm going to go wider and beyond the book. This book took me just 50 years to write. 50 years of traveling around Europe, witnessing events, meeting people, writing everything down in small notebooks like this. I might make a note about this evening too, if you say something interesting. You can actually see my notebooks on my website. Studying Europe in more conventional ways in libraries and archives, worrying about Europe, writing about Europe. And it's a very unusual genre. It's history illustrated by memoir and reportage, right? So it's not a classic memoir, it's not classic reportage. The memoir and the reportage is there to illustrate and drive the history. The stories are there to illuminate the history. So, for example, to tell a story I've told a few times before, it's just after German unification. I'm sitting opposite Helmut Kohl in his office in the Bundeskanzleramt in Bonn. Hands up anyone here who's actually seen Helmut Kohl. I'm sure a few people have. Well, I'm sure you will agree with me that he was the largest human being, certainly I have ever seen, both in height and girth. He was what Dr. Johnson called a mountainous man. And Kohl was the man who just reunited Germany, was towering over me in his office in Bonn. And suddenly he said, we were talking about, Germany and Europe. And suddenly he said, oh, by the way, do you realize you're sitting opposite the direct successor to Adolf Hitler? What does one say? There's a conversation stopper, if ever I saw one. If I'd been quick enough, what I should have said is, actually, Herr Bundeskanzler, you're wrong, because there was Grand Admiral Dönitz between Hitler and you, right? Because the last Chancellor of United Germany was actually Dönitz, but I was too gobsmacked to think of anything to say. But of course, the point Kohl was trying to make, and it was a profound and serious point, was he was very conscious of his historical responsibility. He was the last serious Chancellor of United Germany since Hitler. Hitler had tried to put a German roof over Europe. He was going to do everything differently and put a European roof over Germany. So the story illustrates a much larger point about the history. Now, this book is in conversation with, a constant conversation with, a book many of you will know, a classic by Tony Judt called PostWar. And Tony's title had an obvious and a hidden meaning. The obvious meaning was after the war, after 1945. That's the war, isn't it? The hidden meaning was after war. That is to say, it was a story of a Europe that was setting out after centuries of war to put war entirely behind it, to move towards a Europe without war. Now, actually, that didn't happen. Think about it. Colonial powers like Britain, France, the Netherlands, Portugal were fighting colonial wars, often brutal colonial wars, to defend their colonies for 30 years after 1945, right? Angola and Mozambique only became independent in the mid-1970s. And of course, in Eastern Europe, in the Europe behind the Iron Curtain, as Václav Havel pointed out, they didn't have peace. You mentioned the invasions, the invasion of Hungary in 1956, of Czechoslovakia in 68, Stan Wojenny in Poland, literally a state of war in 1981, violent repression. The day after the Berlin Wall came down, I met a young East German walking down the street, terribly excited, of course, and he said to me that he'd just seen an improvised poster glued to some wall, and it said, "Only today is the war really over." And I think that's a profound truth. For Eastern Europe, only in 1989 was the war really over. And so after the 9th of November 1989, we move into a new period, which I call not post-war Europe, but post-wall Europe, the Europe that comes after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which set out finally to be a Europe without walls and without wars, a Europe whole and free, a Europe moving towards perpetual peace. And yet, here we are, 2023, and we have still raging on our continent the largest war in Europe since 1945. When I set out writing this book about 5 years ago, I thought that in order to bring home to young Europeans the kind of hell that Europe could so easily become, I had to go back and find the last survivors who still remembered Europe in 1945. So I do that at the beginning of the book. I go to, through the person of my father who landed on the first wave of D-Day, I go back to France and Germany and Poland and talk to the survivors. But today, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to see hell, all you have to do is to take a train from the little Polish town of Przemysl and take a 9 or 10 hour train journey to Kiev, and you're back in it. I've done that 3 times in the last 9 months. I describe near the end of the book meeting a man who I identify only as Yevgen. Yevgen was a guy like anyone in this room. He was a translator, an editor, a cultural critic. Late 30s, full-scale invasion, 24th of February 2022, and he said, I've got to do something to defend my country's freedom, so he signs up. Trained as a grenade launcher, sees some fierce fighting, wounded, invalided out, gets better, goes back again, spends months in the bitter infantry fighting to recapture Kherson. You remember Kherson, just on the right bank of the Dnipro. Living for most of the time in a foxhole he dug out himself with a spade he carried on his shoulder, like something out of the First World War, seeing his friends killed all around him. Badly wounded a second time, invalided out to Lviv, took months to get better. When I met him in early December last year, he was just preparing to go back because he said, the inexperienced recruits really need me. They need experienced soldiers because experienced soldiers can stop them getting killed. What I don't say in the book, because the news came too late, is that Yevgen Hulevich was killed on the last day of 2022 in the murderous fighting around Bakhmut, Ukraine's Passchendaele. For days on end, they couldn't even find his body in the bloody mud around Bakhmut. He's now buried in the military cemetery in Lviv. And he is just one of so many. The level of casualties in this war is absolutely staggering. According to US estimates, reported in the New York Times the other day, the war dead, the fatalities of this country of just about 40 million people in 1.5 years are between 70,000 and 100,000. As the New York Times pointed out, that is more than the total US war dead in the entire 2 decades of its involvement in Vietnam. Think about that. 1.5 years, much smaller country. And there's no end in sight. No end in sight. People are getting killed and wounded as we speak this evening. So what I want to do this evening in the next 30, 35 minutes or so is 3 things. First of all, I want to describe briefly how Europe got from that high point to this low point, right? More of that in the book. Secondly, I want to explore a little bit with you why. How do we explain how things went wrong? And then very briefly, I'll say a few words about, make a few comments about what now, and then we can go straight into the discussion and the Q&A. So first of all, how do we get there? The story of post-war Europe, which I submit began on the 9th of November 1989 and ended on the 24th of February 2022, so my argument is it ended with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, is like a game of football, proper football, European football, a game of 2 halves. The first half is a story of quite extraordinary, unprecedented progress towards a Europe whole and free, the spread of freedom and democracy, and the enlargement of the geopolitical West, meaning the EU and NATO, and that goes from 1989 till about 2007. So 1989, still only 12 countries in what was not yet the EU and 15 countries in NATO, and the whole of Eastern Europe was still authoritarian regimes. 2007, 27 countries in the EU, 25 in NATO, including the Baltic states, countries like Estonia that did not even exist on the political map of Europe in 1989, although they always existed in the hearts and minds of their own people. And there they are, democracies, safe and secure in the geopolitical West. Of course, it's not a simple, continuous upward curve. That's not how history works. So you had within this period 5 wars in former Yugoslavia. I write about them in detail. And you had 9/11. But interestingly, and we might want to talk about this, Randall, in the discussion, one of the things I found out in working on this book is that 9/11 does not appear, with benefit of hindsight, to be such a major turning point in European history, right? So it's a major turning point in US history, in Middle Eastern history, and of course, I don't need to tell you, anything that happens in the United States affects us, so in that sense, indirectly. But it's not the major turning point. The major turning point in European history, the beginning of what I call the downward turn, is 2008. The near simultaneous beginning of the global financial crisis and Putin's seizure of 2 great chunks of Georgia begin a cascade of crises that go through the next 15 years all the way down. So you have the global financial crisis segues into what we call the Great Recession in countries like Britain, but crucially into the Eurozone crisis, which plagues particularly southern European countries like Greece for years to come after 2010. In 2010 already, Viktor Orban, shockingly, starts demolishing democracy in Hungary. Hungary is no longer a democracy. A shocking fact that a full member state of the European Union is no longer a democracy. 2014, of course, you have Putin's seizure of Crimea, and as Ukrainians always remind us, the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war in eastern Ukraine, which has now been going on for more than 9 years. It didn't just begin last year. 2015, the refugee crisis, which so shakes up European politics that the nationalist populist right gets a huge boost. The AfD in Germany in 2017 becomes the biggest opposition party in the German parliament, and Marine Le Pen scores extremely well in the presidential elections. Brexit in 2016, or accurately the Brexit vote, Trump, and then all the way down through the COVID pandemic to the 24th of February, 2022. Now, just as in the first half of this game of two halves, not everything was on the upward curve, the wars in former Yugoslavia, 9/11, of course, not everything is downhill in the second period. So in particular, it's important to say that the EU, the European Union, not merely survived these crises, but in significant respects has become stronger through them. Nietzsche's "what doesn't kill me makes me strong." So there's a countervailing development, but nonetheless, we have to ask ourselves why, after nearly 20 years when things seem to be going so well from the point of view of a liberal European like me, or I think a liberal Canadian too, liberal with a small L, by the way, suddenly you had this downward turn and you had this cascade of crises. And that brings me to the second part of my remarks, which is the question, why? Why the downward turn? I'm just going to suggest three elements of an explanation. Of course, it's not a comprehensive explanation. The first one is our old Greek friend, hubris. Hubris in multiple varieties. Hubris in almost every area of European politics. Let me give you a few very quickly. The hubris of the United States, believing that if you march into Iraq and topple the dictator, somehow miraculously a wonderful democracy would emerge from the ruins of the dictatorship. An illusion, by the way, nourished by the miracle of the Velvet Revolutions in 1989 and what followed. Someone like Paul Wolfowitz was really inspired by that. The hubris of cool Britannia, which is an example of what the German sociologist Andreas Reckwitz calls apatistic liberalism. Apatistic liberalism. Slightly jargony word, but then he is a German sociologist. But what it means, and it's actually quite interesting, is unlimited opening in all directions. You open your economy, you open your finances, you open your borders, you open your culture, you open in every direction without anticipating that there might be a backlash. And that's very much the contribution of Blair's Cool Britannia to Brexit. The hubris of my closest friends in East Central Europe, and I myself, who believed that after a quarter century of struggle, when countries like Poland and Hungary had got into the European Union and NATO, that was it. Mission accomplished, to coin a phrase, right? They were consolidated democracy, and that democracy would be secured and guaranteed by membership of the European Union. Viktor Orban proved us completely wrong, and I'm afraid the Law and Justice Party in Poland, we might want to talk about that too, because there's a crucial election just coming up in Poland on the way to prove us wrong too. The hubris of the Eurozone, the idea that you could hitch together such diverse economies, have a common currency without a common treasury, and what so many great economists had warned about, the asymmetric shocks, would not provoke a major crisis. The hubris of the EU itself, which in the early 2000s tended to believe that the rest of the world simply had graciously to follow the example we were given of post-national multi-level governance, right? A book by Mark Leonard, published 2005, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. Well, it didn't exactly happen like that. The hubris of a globalized, financialized capitalism, I formulate carefully, which not only gave us the financial crisis and levels of inequality not seen for 100 years, but also nourished the illusion that global aggregate gains would not merely justify but compensate for specific local losses, right? So think about it. It's perfectly true that globalized, financialized capitalism lifted hundreds of millions of people in India and China out of poverty, right? And the economists said that compensates for the losses in the post-industrial north of England or the Rust Belt of the United States or northeastern France. But it didn't compensate to the people who actually lost their jobs, who found themselves much poorer and being ignored and disrespected by people in the metropolitan capital. So it didn't compensate for the local specific losses. The hubris more broadly of a liberalism which increasingly was reduced just to one dimension, economic liberalism, right? But a liberalism which is only one-dimensional, economic, is no liberalism at all. It has to have the social, the political, and the cultural dimensions, and not least the hubris of this Europe which believed that we really could be post-war forevermore, move to an era of Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace, without the military dimension of power, that we could achieve it simply by non-military means, by dialogue, by diplomacy, and by economic interdependence, right? So energy dependence on Russia was good because that was going to underpin the peace. So why not have yet another gas pipeline, even after Putin had seized Crimea and started the Russo-Ukrainian war? Let me remind you that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was conceived, agreed, and implemented entirely after 2014. Well, the war in Ukraine has taught us something different. So that's a kind of anthology of hubris, if you like. Now, I think underpinning the anthology of hubris is a more fundamental mistake, which is a mistake we made about history, actually, about the way history happens. Put at the simplest, this was a fallacy of extrapolation. So we took the way things had gone for the last 20, 30 years and gradually came to assume that this is the way they would go on going, right? There'd be setbacks along the way, but there'd just be setbacks. We took the most non-linear event in modern European history, namely the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, which was a 1 in a million example of historical luck. We could perhaps talk about that a bit more in discussion, and made a linear projection forward. This was the normal way. This was the way things were to go. Or to state it most generally, we took history with a small h, which is always the product of the interaction between deep structure and process on the one hand, and contingency, conjuncture, chance, collective will, and individual leadership on the other. That's how history actually happens. And we turned it into history with a capital H, a Hegelian process of the inevitable progress towards freedom, right? But freedom is not a process. Freedom is always a struggle. This is what Ukrainians are reminding us of today, that freedom is something that always has to be fought for. For me, the word of the year, and I know we have Professor Margushi here, a great expert on Ukraine, so he's going to have to forgive my pronunciation. For me, the word of the year is the Ukrainian word volya. Now, the word volya means freedom, but also willpower. It has within it the notion of the will, so it's a will to freedom. That freedom, actually Germany has an equivalent, although not many German politicians used it for about 50 years, Freiheitswille. So it's a combination of freedom and willpower. And that's a lesson of the last few years, that freedom always has to be fought for. My final contribution to the conversation about why is another lesson of history, but a quite specific lesson of history. Hands up those of you who know the work of the great German historian Reinhard Koselleck. A couple of hands go up. Well, the rest of you, if you get a chance, read Koselleck, because he's a fantastic historian. And he has a wonderful essay which is called The Unknown Future and the Art of Prognosis. And he makes a very simple point, which is the more often a phenomenon recurs in history, the more likely we are to be able to make probabilistic statements about the future when such a phenomenon recurs, right? So, for example, the statement, "you will all die," can be made with a reasonably high level of certainty, if you'll forgive me saying so, because in a huge historical database, there is no known example to the contrary, right? Revolutions, wars, what happens to people when they've been in power too long? These are such recurrent phenomena. There are so many examples in history that when it recurs again, you can make probabilistic statements, not definite predictions, but probabilistic statements. Now, another such phenomena is declining empires. Let me tell you something about declining empires, which history teaches us. They don't like it. Ask the British. Ask the French. Ask the Dutch. Ask the Spanish. Ask the Portuguese, right? There's a whole history of declining empires fighting back to try and either defend or recover their empires. So when the largest remaining empire in Europe, the Russian Soviet Empire, softly and suddenly vanished away in just 3 years between 1989 and 1991, we should not have assumed that was the end of the story. I tell in the book the story of meeting Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg in 1994. He was then totally unknown, deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, a rather unpleasant-looking man sitting at a conference, a German-Russian conference. And suddenly he pipes up and says, "We have to remember that there are territories that historically always belonged to Russia." Note the always, crucial word, that historically always belonged to Russia. Not true, of course. And he specifically mentions Crimea. And he says there are 25 million Russians living outside the Russian Federation, and we have a duty towards them. 1994, just 3 years after the end of the Soviet Union. Don't tell me that the eastward enlargement of NATO is the cause of Putin's aggression towards Ukraine. The imperialist, the revanchist instinct, the desire to get Russia's great power back was there way back then and only got stronger. So, ladies and gentlemen, we did our best to help Russia modernize. We tried to integrate Russia into the liberal international community. But when the empire started striking back, you could say Transnistria in Moldova already 1992. You could say Chechnya, but that was legally within the bounds of the Russian Federation. But across international frontiers, Georgia, 2008, and above all, 2014, we should have adapted our policy. We should have said, yes, we understand what's happening. This is the empire striking back, and we have to have a different policy. For me, 2014 is a turning point at which the West failed to turn. And frankly, if we'd had a different response in 2014, I think we wouldn't be in the mess we're in today. And again, we could happily discuss in question time and in conversation who bears most responsibility for that. The name Angela Merkel might need to be mentioned. So that's the why. And now I come to the third part of my talk, which is just a few remarks about where we go from here, and then I look forward to the conversation. So first of all, we're in the middle of this bloody war. The casualties are enormous. The cost in money and lives is enormous. And we increasingly hear voices calling for quote-unquote peace, for negotiations. Let me tell you that this would be absolutely the wrong way for us in the West to go. The only way forward to a lasting peace in Europe, with implications not just for Europe, by the way, is for Ukraine to win this war, to achieve something that can credibly be called victory, and that means staying the course. If we went for a peace now, which would be based on Russia de facto controlling roughly a fifth of Ukraine's territory, maybe a little bit less, a territory the size of Greece, that would mean that 5 to 7 million Ukrainians would have to make the choice either between losing everything and starting a new life abroad, like, you know, the Germans and the Poles in 1945-46, or going back to an occupied territory where they would have to speak a language they no longer want to speak and send their children to schools where they would be taught an utterly mendacious version of the history of their country. It would mean that in Ukraine itself, and I can't emphasize this too much, there would be an overwhelming sense of defeat, of loss, and a deep frustration at the West for letting them down. And when I was last in Ukraine in July, I was already beginning to feel this sense of frustration. It would mean that back home in Russia, Putin could claim victory. Okay, it's not his maximal objective, but he's got the land bridge from Donbass to Crimea. He's got these territories which he sees in historical terms as Novorossiya, New Russia, right? He said the other day, even Putin the Great didn't manage to control the entirety of the Sea of Azov. So back home he could claim victory, which would mean he'd be in power probably for years to come. It would be a defeat for us, for Europe, for the US, for Canada, for the entire West, because we are, I mean, at the latest after Joe Biden made his visit to Kiev, we are committed, and I think your Prime Minister has been too, you know, we are committed. Our reputation is at stake, and above all, it would mean that President Xi would think, well, I might have a go at Taiwan. If Putin can get away with taking Crimea, maybe I can get away with taking Taiwan. So people say, do you want us to get into the Third World War? Well, if you want us to have a higher risk of getting into the Third World War, let Ukraine lose, let Putin win. So we have to stay the course. And I'm sorry to say that on the 80th anniversary of D-Day next year, 6th of June, 2024, there will still be a war probably going on in Ukraine, and maybe even the year after. And we have to stick with them. We have to give them the support. Interestingly, the biggest danger to Ukraine now is no longer in Europe. Last year, I was really worried about Europeans. The biggest danger to Ukraine now is the US. There's dwindling support. You look at the public opinion polls, look at the congressional debates. Above all, if Donald Trump, which heaven forbid, became president of the United States again, that would be a disaster for Ukraine. So that's point number one. Point number two, if we can help Ukraine to something that can plausibly be called victory, and we can talk about what that means, then suddenly an extraordinary period of opportunity again opens up for Europe. I talked about that great process of eastward enlargement. Basically, it stalled after 2008. 15 years, Croatia came into the EU, a couple of smaller countries into NATO, but basically it stalled. Nobody else was coming in. We stopped. There was a paralysis. Heraclitus says war is the father of all things, and in this case too, because the war in Ukraine has unblocked this process, and suddenly there's a really serious discussion about a new great eastward enlargement of the EU, Ukraine, Moldova, potentially Georgia if they get their politics right, and the Western Balkans, 6 countries in the Western Balkans. So suddenly there's a really serious discussion of heading up towards an EU of 35, including Ukraine, and with it comes a discussion about NATO, because frankly, it's now clearer than ever that those two things go together, EU and NATO. You know, Sweden and Finland, who for years were members of the EU but not of NATO, in response to the war in Ukraine have joined NATO, right? And so they're the two strong arms of the West, and increasingly, as by the way, it was the case in the 1990s too, this is what people like Václav Havel saw, you have to have both. And for this, and I mentioned this since one of the sponsors of the evening is the DAAD, the German studies, Germany, Europe's central power, is absolutely crucial. simplifying greatly, you have a position where the Eastern Europeans are all fired up for this eastward enlargement, and many West European countries are hesitant, although interestingly, France has shifted its position in a very significant way. But Germany is Europe's central power. It's by far the most powerful country in Europe, and it needs Germany really make a commitment, a strategic commitment to this project, and that has not yet happened. Simplifying greatly, in the history of the Federal Republic, which will be 75 next year, 75 years old, there have been three great national projects of international significance. The so-called Westbindung, which was integrating West Germany into the West under Konrad Adenauer, the so-called Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt, which was a great opening to the East, starting in the 1970s, and the thing I just talked about with Helmut Kohl, putting German and European unification together in the 1990s, interlinking them. Three great projects, okay? My argument is we now need a fourth great project. Let's call it, have a nice catchy German word, a Gesamteuropapolitik, an all-Europe policy. And for that, the great new eastward enlargement, we need German leadership. Third observation. Okay, so I've said we had the post-war period, and then we had the post-wall period, which I argue goes from the 9th of November 1989 to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So what period are we in now? Discuss. A period without a name, whose character we don't know, but here's just one candidate, just one possibility. It's another post-W, post-Western. So one of the real shocks of the war in Ukraine has been to discover that while it's reunited the West, it's divided us from the rest, right? That not just China, but India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, several major democracies in that list are all quite fine with being partners with Russia, allies with Russia even, doing joint military exercises with Russia, buying the Russian oil that we are no longer buying, even though Vladimir Putin is fighting a war of recolonization in Ukraine. And you make that argument to Indian friends and it gets almost nowhere. Because the resentment of the West and of a world in which the West has been calling the shots for so long is just so strong, and also because they have their own interests as great powers. So to discuss, I mean, it'd be interesting to open up that theme, but that's certainly one of the things, one of the revelations of the spirit, so that ironically, this period that starts with the greatest triumph of the West in 1989 ends with us going into a post-Western world. And this brings me to my final point, which is the external global context for trying to build a Europe whole and free was overwhelmingly favorable in 1989. It's very unfavorable now. So one or two of you, maybe among the students here, will have said, well, this guy's been talking for 38 minutes, and he hasn't mentioned climate change. Okay, I'm going to mention it now. So in the 50 years I've been traveling in Europe, since the early 1970s, average global temperatures have increased 0.5 degrees. That is more than in the 11,000 years from the end of the last ice age to 1900. In July this year, for the first time, global average temperatures were above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is the UN target we're supposed not to breach. Demography. The world population, 4 billion when I set out in the early 70s, now over 8 billion and still going up. poverty, disease, Randall's great subject, mass migration, which of course connects to those great forces, the post-Western geopolitics that I talked about a moment ago, and then the US. You know, in 1989, the US looked so powerful and, dare I say this in Canada, so attractive, at least to many Europeans. So the United States in 1989 had terrific both hard and soft power, right? The poster for the breakthrough election in Poland on the 4th of June 1989 just showed Gary Cooper walking down the street, you know, in high noon, with the Solidarity label on his lapel, and all it needed to say was, high noon, the 4th of June 1989, and everybody got the message. That's soft power for you. But today, you would have to look long and hard to find a single European who thinks that US politics and society are any kind of model for anyone to follow. US business may be, US tech, yes, US culture in some respects, but not US politics and society. And of course, you have a major crisis of US democracy and the prospect of another President Trump, which would be a disaster not just for Ukraine. So what do we need for this? I see already many, many questions gathering there, which is great to see. So I will conclude on this note. What do we need to face these extraordinarily difficult challenges? It's the old combination: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Or to close with some words of, for me, perhaps one of the greatest Europeans I've known, Václav Havel, who said the same thing in a slightly different way. I quote, "Hope is not prognostication. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. Hope is an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out." End of quotation. Ladies and gentlemen, defending, improving, and extending a free Europe, including a free Ukraine, makes sense. It's a cause worthy of hope. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Timothy, for for an outstanding lecture. Exactly, I have to say what I expected. Questions are coming in. Anyone else, if you'd like to jot one down, please do so. Hand it on to Adam. He'll bring it up. I'll ask a general question and then go into the first one. The gloom. Clearly someone who spent a lot of time studying in Germany. This is a gloomy lecture. And Lucan Way, who's in the audience, told me that one motto for understanding Ukraine and perhaps the rest of Europe is that it can always get worse. And I think that's not a bad way forward. But peak to peak and trough to trough, which is to say, in economics or in political economics, if you want to exaggerate a government's performance, you're about to have an election, you measure the economy from the base of the last recession to the peak of the boom. And if you're the opposition, you do the opposite. And that massively exaggerates economic growth and massively underestimates it. So things look rough now compared to the heady days of the early 90s, though let's not forget the nasty recession. If we think to the 1970s, which is in your broader arc of progress, we had the oil crisis, we had flattened economies. Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing were very worried that the EU would collapse in the face of economic crisis. We had terrorism in Germany. The Italian Republic seemed on the verge of collapsing in its face. And we didn't have war in Europe as such, but we had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the context of spiraling prices in a very real feel that they would march on to the Gulf. So I'll give you that and ask yourself, is it not that that brief period of progress and optimism wasn't the aberration, and the Europe we have now is the Europe that we've had for many, many decades. And indeed, the 70s in some ways was worse. Question one. Question two, this is from the floor. What can we learn from the backlash in order to save the EU and Europe? How can the EU continue to survive and continue to be a uniting force, considering the backlash to EU policies in Central and Eastern Europe, and the relevance of that for the Balkans? And that was actually my question. You're a great partisan of EU enlargement, yet if someone read your demolition chapter in the book, they would say, this is actually perhaps not a great idea, because look what happened last time, and what's to prevent this happening again? A deep democratic backsliding on the part of states that join the EU. Put a technical spin on that. Do the treaties not need to be revised in a manner that creates a mechanism for, if not chucking countries out of the EU, at least seriously sanctioning them with qualified majority voting, so the Poles can't defend the Hungarians and the Hungarians the Poles?
Thanks for several great questions, Randall. I think it's probably more than two. On gloom, there's a wonderful aphorism by Stanislav Lec who says, "I thought I'd reached bottom, and then I heard tapping from underneath." And I've thought of that occasionally in the last few years. Look, you've clearly been reading my lecture notes, because in another version of this lecture, I have a passage apropos pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the world, precisely about the 1970s, because you're absolutely right. Things look really bad for the West. I mean, you could add Vietnam, Watergate, so-called normalization in Czechoslovakia. I mean, if you read the biography of Václav Havel, even Havel nearly despaired in the early 1970s. As you said, terrorism, you didn't very politely mention that Britain seemed to be going down the tubes, all the way down to the winter of discontent. So things did look really bad. In historical perspective, however, that if you take the curve for Europe after 1945, I would say it's like that, and then a little bit of a dip, and then back up and going on up, just as a historical statement. The lesson from it, I think, is that we got out of it quite well, and you've written a whole book about this, because we faced up to the problems, because we had pessimism of the intellect, right? We understood where the problems, we did a kind of ruthless analysis of what had gone wrong and instituted some fairly radical reforms, which of course in their consequences created the problems we have today, 20, 30, 40 years later. But that, and this connects to the next question, that's clearly what we need to do today. We need to look absolutely, honestly, understand how deep our problems are. The reason I think they're much deeper than in the 1970s is what I talked about in the last 5 minutes of my lecture. The global complex, climate change, democracy, global poverty, water shortage, another superpower called China, the position taken by the non-Western powers. That's a completely different and much less favorable external context from the context we had in the 1970s, when our great competitor in a bipolar world, the Soviet Union, was actually just entering into a period of stagnation, right? So that would be my answer to that. Now on EU, 3 quick points. First of all, beware intra-European Orientalism. That is the tendency which goes all the way back to the European Enlightenment, for people in Western Europe or the West to talk about Eastern Europe as if it's somehow inherently not quite proper Europe, that it's vaguely barbaric and anachronistic, and always tending to the authoritarian. Randall, Marine Le Pen would be entirely at home in Jarosław Kaczynski's Poland. Nigel Farage would be entirely at home in Viktor Orban's Hungary. Vox in Spain would be entirely at home in Romania. I mean, we have very similar phenomenon, just with a post-communist specificity. You are absolutely right. The big mistake we made in the enlargement was not the enlargement itself, but not building in to the larger EU mechanisms of enforcing the values of democracy, respect for human rights, and the rule of law, which are in Article 2 of the treaty. So basically, while you were trying to get in, you had to be squeaky clean. You had to be actually doing things better than many countries that were in the EU. But as soon as you got in, as Orban realized, you could, to use a colloquial English phrase, get away with murder, right? There was no effective sanction on you, and it's taken decades to start addressing that problem. To the larger question of the future enlargement, that's one of the things we have to get right. But I'll just make one quick point. People often think about the European project in terms of, quote unquote, ever closer union. That's not what the European project is really about. You can't have a United States of Europe with 35 different countries and 550 million people. What the European project is really about is the quest, which has been going on ever since the end of the Roman Empire, to find the right balance between unity and diversity. I mean, actually, some countries face these balances. They're difficult balances even in large countries. But that's the key to success for the European Union. That's the key to a successful enlargement, to have a mixture of unity and diversity, so we're united where we need to be, but diverse when we don't.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll pair a couple of questions to try and make sure we get through them. First one, as a person who grew up in the communist East, how was Merkel so blind to Moscow's aims? And this is my spin, not the questioner's. We held a panel here where we talked about the legacy of Merkel just as she was leaving office. We talked about the refugee crisis, we talked about the Euro crisis, we talked about the German economy. Not one person on the panel, and I was one of them, and not one questioner raised any question about energy. So I wonder if the deluge of criticism, which is landing on Merkel, isn't running through a canyon called hindsight. And the idea that you would integrate powers economically, Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, isn't a bad one. It rather worked in the case of the European Union. Second question, is war in Europe the norm? Proposition.
Gosh, these are wonderful questions. Well, the thing is, Randall, that historians operate with hindsight. That's why it's such fun, because we know better. The retrospectoscope is a wonderful instrument. Although I would say, well, it sounds immodest, but some of us started warning around 2014, 2015. Angela Merkel is currently writing her memoirs. It's going to be fascinating to read them. Someone humorously proposed a title for them, and the title was My Excuses. But she has a lot to answer for, and the Merkel paradox is that she is one of the most extraordinary human beings in European politics in the last 80 years. This young woman scientist from the East who becomes the most powerful person not only in West Germany, but in, some would say, well, certainly in Europe, and remains modest, reasonable, rational, calm, civilized, liberal conservative. I mean, she personifies all the best qualities of United Germany, and yet the list of her mistakes is very long. Not responding faster and more decisively to the Eurozone crisis. If Merkel had said in 2010, we're going to do whatever it takes to keep the Eurozone together, the whatever it takes would have been much, much less. The panicky, Randall, the panicky flight from nuclear power in response to the Fukushima disaster, not a rational judgment at all, has made the energy transition in Germany much more difficult. The failure to respond to 2014, I absolutely agree with you. I think it was right to try to help Russia to modernize, but come 2014, the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war and the seizure of Crimea, we should have changed our policy. Hungary, Angela Merkel is the one European leader who could have stopped the Central European University being kicked out of Budapest. A great Canadian, Michael Ignatieff, a great friend of mine, who was, of course, the president of the Central European University, once said to me, the one thing that could have kept the CEU in Budapest was a telephone call from Angela Merkel to Viktor Orban. It was a call that never came. And making Germany so economically dependent on China. So it's one hell of a list. And I think if you ask why, because she was someone who managed existing systems very well, but was not good at thinking outside the box and trying to make change, because rather like Obama, she was the outsider who'd come into the existing system. And then she did have a fascination with Russia. She had a picture of Catherine the Great on her wall. She just did. War the norm. So what I say in the book is that the strongest case for the European Union, for everything we've tried to do in Europe since 1945, is not a Panglossian optimism. It's a constructive pessimism. It's an understanding that unless you have all these structures of cooperation and integration and peaceful conflict resolution, Europe will go back to its bad old ways, right? As it did in former Yugoslavia, as it had in Ukraine. So what I say is that year zero, you know, the idea of year zero, 1945 was year zero. I say in Europe, zero is a recurring number. There's always a danger that Europe will go back to its bad old ways. So I'm not going to accept that it's the norm, because I think that Europeans have at last learned from their history. They're conscious of that. They're trying very hard not to fall back into their bad old ways, but the danger is always there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. These are some questions on Ukraine, and I'll three of them that are sort of related. The first is I think you've answered it, but I'll put it out again. It's the enlargement question. Was Russia not threatened by the enlargement of NATO? You spoke to that, but may wish to speak to it again. This is the effect back on the EU. Has the Russian invasion of Ukraine actually improved relations of the EU member states? In particular, I wonder if you could have any observations on the German-Polish relationship, and what should Europeans do to prepare should the Orangemen win again in 2024? President Trump.
In England, we think of Ulster when
Yes, no, I thought that might throw you off.
Well, that last question, I should put to every single one of us, I should think. Okay. NATO enlargement is not the cause of Putin's aggression towards Ukraine, and actually I document in the book how when it was happening, the actual enlargement, up to and including the Baltic states, Putin did not strongly object to it. George Robertson, the former Secretary General of NATO, told me he had 9 meetings with Putin while it was happening. Putin didn't raise the subject. Condoleezza Rice told me he didn't raise the subject till 2007. There's lots of evidence of that. There was not, interestingly, the trigger for his aggressive response to Ukraine was EU enlargement. It was the EU association in 2014, not NATO. But undoubtedly what we did at the Bucharest summit of NATO was a mistake, because if you remember, the Bush administration wanted to enlarge. Germany, Angela Merkel again, didn't want to enlarge. And what we got was a compromise which was the worst of both worlds, in which we had a statement in the NATO concluding communique which said that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, and then didn't do anything about it. Right? That was absolutely the worst of both worlds. It increased the threat perception in Moscow without increasing the security of Ukraine. So that, I think, was a mistake, but not NATO enlargement as a whole. Indeed, ask yourself this question. Would you be sleeping easily in your bed in the Estonian city of Tallinn, let alone Narva on the Russian frontier, if you weren't in NATO today. Ukraine has certainly brought back the West together again. And the European Union, on the whole, has had a solid response to the crisis in Ukraine. The EU is even funding ammunition and weapons itself for Ukraine. But I wouldn't say it's sort of wonderfully improved relations between all EU member states, because Viktor Orban, of course, is effectively, de facto, being a friend of Putin in this crisis. He's and exacting his price for every further round of sanctions. There are one or two other countries. Slovakia has an election on the 30th of September, and Slovakian opinion is very wobbly on this. So there are actually tensions. Germany-Poland is nothing to do with Ukraine. Germany-Poland is about the Nationalist Populist Party, peace, law and justice, trying to win a third election and consolidate their power, and doing it by some truly sickening anti-German propaganda. I mean, at great risk to my personal health, I sometimes watch Polish state TV, and it's really quite shocking what you hear there. And Europe preparing for Trump. Well, what I can say to you is that the prospect of another Trump presidency is very much concentrating European minds. So I would say it's already a catalyst of kind of strengthening European security and European defense and European unity. But at the same time, the Ukraine war has made it plain that we can't defend ourselves against Russia. Europe is in no position to defend ourselves against Russia. So if this guy comes in and really pulls the rug from under us, I don't know what we're going to do. So ideally, perhaps, we should get really scared, do all the things we should have done to strengthen European security and European cooperation, and then he should not get elected.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Another question. This comes to Germany. You've mentioned that we need Germany and Germany's support for a large European project. What's in it for the Germans? What are the advantages for Germany in EU enlargement? And how can we get Germany on our side?
Well, first of all, if you take your motto from Helmut Kohl, that German and European unification is the two sides of the same coin, there's a fundamental interest in principle to have a stable, free Europe, a Europe whole and free. But in addition to that, I would mention two interests. One is, if you're Madrid or Paris, you can get worried that the center of Europe is moving eastwards, right? But where's it going to move to? It's not going to move to Tallinn or Bucharest. It's going to move to somewhere around Berlin. So geopolitically, Germany would be even more the central power than it was before. Secondly, the economic interest. I mean, this is, read Friedrich Naumann's book, Mitteleuropa. I mean, this is traditional German economic territory. I've never forgotten a Polish economist saying the other day, actually a few years ago, as if it was self-evident. Of course, the Polish economy is part of the German economy. And a part of German economic success has to do with cheaper skilled labor being just next door in East Central Europe. So you build your car factory in Poland or Slovakia, and it's a great economic model. So take that a step further. How about building your next factory in Ukraine, a post-war Ukraine, where you have cheaper skilled labor, because actually the price of labor in East Central Europe is going up, and you have a larger market. And so I think that Germany particularly also has an economic as well as a broader security and geopolitical interest in this. But it needs the Chancellor to lead this process. Germany, as you know very well, is a Kanzlerdemokratie. The way it's shaped, even if you have other politicians like Robert Habeck or Annalena Baerbock, the Greens, who see this, it needs the Chancellor to lead, and we're not yet getting that sort of strategic leadership.
Okay, great. Two questions I'll group here. What are your thoughts on Belarus emerging as a proxy war? And can you speak to the place of the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict in the post-Wall and post-22 period? Why is Europe, I think it probably means the EU, silent on this? And what are the implications of such silence for the durability of the European order?
You're giving me a serious geopolitical workout here, I must say. So listen, Armenia, Azerbaijan, it's not a subject on which I'm an expert, but what I would say is that if we get into this mode of the big new eastward enlargement over the next decade, remember Georgia is already on the list as a potential EU member. That is going to take us very much more into the Caucasus. So I think while Europe is not playing a key role there now, with time it would be on the agenda. And by the way, what we're talking about here, because I mentioned declining empires, is what you do after empire, right? That's what empires leave behind, is conflicts like this. In the Balkans, we were dealing with the conflicts left behind by the Ottoman Empire 100 years before, right? So either what you do after empire, if you're not going to leave them in the Russian sphere of influence, is leave them in no man's land, in a grey zone, and then there'll be more and more conflict. Or you try and bring them into this order which does Georgia rather than war. Now, Belarus, I do have a clear view on. We have to be very, very careful not to forget Belarus and just consign it to the Russian sphere of influence. Belarus had, over the last 4 years, one of the largest, most impressive examples of civil resistance in the entire history of civil resistance. For nearly 2 years, large crowds came out day after day. Some women-only marches, they were called the White Protests. I mean, extraordinary example of civil resistance. It has quite an impressive government in exile, a woman called Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. So there is a major aspiration in Belarusian society to be an independent country and eventually to be a free country, actually between Europe and Russia, with good relations with both. So let's not just consign them to the darkness, behind the Iron Curtain again, although at the moment, clearly the effect of the Ukraine war has been to drag Lukashenko further into Putin's embrace. And there is a real danger that some operations into Ukraine will be conducted from Belarusian territory. But we need to keep it on our radar screen and keep reminding ourselves that it is part of Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. This is the question about the hope for a Russian Stauffenberg. What are the chances of a coup? And then let me tack on a couple of other questions. A general one: what can be done to stop these authoritarian tendencies in Europe? I think Poland and Hungary. And a more specific question: how stable is Ukraine internally, given the recent changes in leadership in its defense ministry and the need to deal with corruption?
Okay, so let me take those in reverse order. So within the EU, it's a question of the drift toward rightward nationalist populist politics. And because many of you will have thought about Brexit. So you remember the conversation was, are there going to be more Brexits? Is there going to be Polexit and Hungexit and Italexit? There's absolutely no sign that's going to happen because they now have a different strategy, which is to change the EU by staying inside it and changing it from within. So the danger is that the EU itself is gradually detached from the liberal democratic values that are proclaimed in Article 2 of its treaty and is taken towards a more anti-liberal, nativist, particularist version of Europe as presented by Viktor Orban. So that requires two things. It requires good politics in the countries concerned, i.e., let's get the Polish opposition united so they win this election rather than losing it, as the united opposition in Hungary lost the election last year. But it also requires an effort on the part of the EU to reconnect the Europe of values and the Europe of money. So that's authoritarian tendencies. Okay, possibility of a coup. Well, there was a man called Mr. Prigozhin. Remember him? It wasn't exactly a coup. It was more like a mutiny. But look what happened to him. Russian air safety clearly needs to improve its record. So nobody knows, but if you talk to what we do know is that Putin is absolutely paranoid about the possibility of a coup, and therefore he's gone to extraordinary lengths in terms of creating the Rosgvardia, the permanent presidential guard, competing security forces, removing anyone who might potentially be a threat to him, changing his place of residence, etc., etc., etc. So that nobody knows. It could happen, but on a realistic assessment, one would have to say the possibility is quite small. What I wouldn't discount is that at some point people around him say, Mr. President, it's really not working. We're not succeeding in Ukraine. We're actually losing out, and we have to have a change of policy. So I think there is a real possibility that at some point you have a change of policy rather than a change of leader, much as I'd like to see a change of leader. I do think it's a case where tyrannicide, since you mentioned Stauffenberg, would be entirely justified, but rather difficult to do. How stable is Ukraine? Look, there's incredible national unity. In a sense, it's more stable than it's ever been, right? Because the war has brought everybody together, and Russian speakers are united with Ukrainian speakers, West and East and Central and South. I mean, there's a fantastic sense of solidarity. I like to say it's like Britain in 1940, okay? But if the war goes on, at some point, the question is posed, well, if this is a war for democracy, don't we need to have an election? Parliamentary elections, in theory, should happen this autumn. Presidential elections next spring. While there's martial law, you can't have elections, so the parliamentary elections are not going to happen. But there is already a discussion about the presidential election. It probably won't happen next spring. But at some point, that discussion is already coming up. And then you will get politics again. And you'll get rival candidates, and Mr. Poroshenko may have a go, or somebody else may have a go. You may get returning officers who are war heroes coming into the political arena. But if you're a democracy, you have got to have democratic politics at some point. So that is going to be a challenge to Ukraine, but nothing like the first challenge, which is they've just got to win this bloody war, and that's what we've got to help them to do. And then, let 100 flowers bloom and let there be complex politics. And it probably wouldn't be a good thing for the country if Zelensky and his party was entrenched in power for 10 years to come.
Okay, good. This question goes in another direction, but you did address this in the book. Please say if the Greek debt crisis could have been resolved differently. You hinted that. Speak to that. And then the general question, without energy security, can the post-West exist?
Okay, Greek debt crisis, absolutely. I tell in the book the story of Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, who was an admirable human being, a dedicated European, extraordinarily courageous. He was in a wheelchair after an assassination attempt and carried on, but bears a heavy responsibility for the Greek debt crisis. And we had him in Oxford in, I think, 2012, 2013, and someone who is now with the Greek Central Bank said to him, don't you understand that the harshness of the measures you're imposing on us is actually driving the Greek economy into a downward spiral, and therefore actually making it more difficult for us ever to pay off our debts? And Schäuble gave an astonishing response. He said, I've never really believed that much in economics. I believe in law, integrity, and political will. And it was a very revealing answer, because it was just bad economics to push Greece so hard. And a combination of Angela Merkel saying, I'm going to do whatever it takes, which would have addressed the whole Eurozone crisis, a much more nuanced approach to the Greek debt crisis would have been much more helpful. And the Greek economy shrunk by 25%. Youth unemployment soared above 50%. I mean, it suffered terribly. So absolutely, yes. Okay, so I'm not sure quite what the questioner was meaning by the post-West, but if you mean us, the existing West, I mean, of course it's a big issue. Energy security. I believe you in Canada are rather lucky in this respect. Of course, the US has had an absolute bonanza with shale and so on. But Europe is not doing badly. I mean, Germany handled, from the point of view of energy security, getting off its dependency on Russian oil, gas, and coal remarkably well. I mean, there's been very rapid adaptation. So I actually believe that given a few more years to do it in, we can quite effectively address our energy security problem, certainly in relation to Russia. But we still have two big kinds of security left. Our defense security dependence on the United States and our economic dependence on China. And I think those are going to be more difficult challenges.
And this leads right into the question. Is there any chance of getting, we are spreading your even broader geopolitical canvas, any possibility to get China on side for the war effort? And then jumping back to Europe, I think you would say Hungary, but what is the weakest link in European solidarity vis-a-vis Ukraine, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland? Who?
Well, weakest link in European solidarity is you got it in one, Hungary, because Viktor Orban is the only guy who goes to European Council meeting and who says, I'm going to block the latest aid package for Ukraine unless you give me this, that, or the other, normally money. Right, and who is in a position to block the opening of negotiations with Ukraine as a candidate for membership of the EU. So this is the issue that is going to be before the European leaders at the end of the year. And it's very, very important for Ukraine that they have the sense of things moving forward. And one of the conditions is about language rights, which maybe you know one or two things about here in Canada. I've heard that there's been an issue sometimes. So there's a Hungarian minority in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, and he's making really exorbitant demands for the language rights of the Hungarian minority, and so he might block it. So he's certainly the biggest problem. But Slovakia, Greece, Bulgaria, there are a bunch of countries that are a bit wobbly, but Germany is not, and Italy, even under Giorgia Meloni, thank heaven, is not. If it had been, another Italian populist, it might have been a different story. So that I think actually European solidarity is going to hold, and as I say, the big worry is the US. Now, China. Obviously, I'm not an expert on China. You have to go to my son for that. But I have thought about this quite a lot and looked at it quite carefully. And the chances of getting China on board in the sense of on our side over the war in Ukraine are zilch, zero, nothing. Actually, in a way, China is sitting pretty as the West slogs it out with Russia. That's, as long as it doesn't upset the apple cart of the world economy, that's not so bad for China. In addition to which, there's a scholar called Joseph Torigian, who one or two of you may have come across, who's done really interesting work. Xi Jinping's father was the Chinese Communist Party apparatchik responsible for relations with Russia. And so Xi grew up with a great fascination with Russia, admiration for Russia. He's often said he loves reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And then he really admires Putin. That's been said many times. So at their last meeting, a microphone caught Xi Jinping saying to Putin, there are changes such as have not been seen in 100 years, right? So this is a formula Xi Jinping often uses in China. Changes not seen in 100 years. But then he added, speaking to Putin, shaking hands, and we're the people who are driving forward these changes. So fundamentally, ideologically, and geopolitically, he sees Putin and Russia as a really important partner in his project of moving beyond a post-Western world. So, you occasionally see stories about will China be a peace broker? I would say forget it.
Okay, last two questions. And yeah, this is a question about what a militaristic Germany means. Germany has tried to keep military power out of its foreign policy and its foreign interventions. How significant is its new approach to Russia, going from sending helmets to sending panzers? Does this not shatter the EU, European hubris about non-militaristic diplomatic relations? What does this mean for Germany's future position and stance? Yeah, actually, why don't you take that, Timothy, and then I'll give you one last question.
One last question. Okay.
After that, yeah.
Hands up, how many people in this room know the word Zeitenwende? Oh, pretty good. So there's a series of German words that have got into English, like Angst or Schadenfreude or Vorsprung durch Technik. And the latest one is this word that Chancellor Scholz used, Zeitenwende, which he used in a speech on the 27th of February, 3 days after the invasion, to describe. And it's very funny seeing how the newspapers struggle to translate it. They always come up with different epochal turning points, something like that, okay? Now, one of the key features of that is we've got to do more about military power. We kidded ourselves we could do it without military. And here's 100 billion euros to build up our military, okay? And actually, if Germany, since it has such a large economy, if it went on spending 2%, got to spending 2% of its GDP, the NATO target on defense, it would have the third largest defense budget in the world. So that would be very significant. But where the question gets interesting is, okay, so that's, you've got the tanks and you've got the planes and you've got the armored personnel carriers, but what are you going to do with them? What are these formidable armed forces there to do? And what's the spirit behind them? And there it gets quite difficult because the whole language of war, even if it's in a really good cause, has been so poisoned by Nazism in Germany. I mean, if you think of a word like Sieg or Kriegsheld, war hero or victory, the head of the German armed forces got into terrible trouble a few months ago because he said our armed forces should be siegesfähig, which means capable of victory or capable of winning. Oh, so what? So you want an army, but it shouldn't be able to win? Seems a vaguely odd idea. You wouldn't say that about the German football team, would you? And I was at a big meeting in Berlin the other day, and I started talking about the Ukrainian theory of victory, the ukrainische Theorie des Sieges. And there was a shudder went through the audience. What do you mean, Theorie des Sieges? This is horrifying. So actually there's a really interesting, quite difficult process where Germany has to understand what it means not just to have big armed forces, but in a good cause to be ready actually to fight, which the Brits have never forgotten, and the Americans have never forgotten, and I hope the Canadians have never forgotten, and the Poles have never forgotten, and the French have never forgotten. But it's gone completely out of fashion in Germany. The German view tends to the view that all war is bad, even if it's a defensive war in a good cause. So there's a very interesting and difficult process for Germany over the next 10 years or so, getting their armed forces to the place where they not only have the kit, but they also have the spirit and training, actually to risk their lives in a good cause.
Great, thank you, Timothy. You've had a lot, but one last question, and this is effectively is Europe becoming Los Angeles? That's my spin, that's not in the question. But what I mean by that is incapable of learning from its mistakes, which I regard as the hallmark of Los Angeles. So, the current history with Putin taking territory, Georgia, Crimea, eastern portions of Ukraine feels very much like the 1920s and the 1930s, taken over by the corporal, by Hitler. Does history repeat or rhyme, and why have we not learned from our history?
So, I'm sure you all know the famous saying about the United States, that you can rely on the United States to do the right thing after exhausting all the alternatives. And that could be a shorthand epigraph for European history, because that's what we have been trying to do since 1945. We have been trying to learn from history, as I tried to say, not well enough. And if I may say so, that is one of the points of this book, because what people do learn from, usually, is personal experience, right? So in the book I explain how this Europe that we've got has been the product of 4 great generations. The 14ers, who were shaped by their personal experience of the First World War, Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill. The 39ers, people like my father who fought in the Second World War. The 68ers, maybe 1 or 2 in this room, who knows. And the 89ers, those who were shaped by the great events of 89. Now, so you have these 4 generations, each of whom, out of their personal experience, have got a lifelong commitment or vision for where they want Europe to be. Now, for the first time, we have a generation of Europeans who have grown up, most of them, knowing nothing but a relatively prosperous, stable, secure, peaceful, free Europe. I mean, not in Yugoslavia, not in Ukraine, but a generation of young Europeans. And the question is, what about them? Are they going to be able to learn from, here's the trick, to learn from history without going through it yourself? And that's why we need schools and universities and people studying history, because that's the whole idea of studying history, to learn from a bad past without going through it ourselves. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So